Imagine a country, so divided, its very foundations feel like they're cracking. It really makes you think about that stark question. What do you do when staying together just feels impossible?
Yeah, and that's right at the heart of the material you shared with us, Split to Survive,
Eh,
the case for a divided Israel. It's a pretty radical idea proposing a national divorce.
exactly. A bold proposition for sure.
Hmm.
The authors are basically saying Israel's facing this fundamental choice: either keep liberal democracy in one part or let a completely different vision take over another. Staying unified, they argue, might lead to a future nobody really wants.
Hmm. And for this deep dive, which we've put together specifically for you, we're honing right in on the historical arguments. You wanted to get the essence of this quickly, right?
Right.
So this first chapter, chapter 1, historical precedents, that's where they really lay the groundwork, looking at how other nations have handled similar deep divisions.
Our goal here is to really unpack the history, cut through the details a bit, and get the core dynamics from the examples they use: Czechoslovakia and Singapore, Malaysia.
Yeah, exactly. We want to understand why they split, how they actually did it, what the outcomes were, and crucially, what the authors think these stories tell us about Israel's situation today.
Okay, so let's dive into Czechoslovakia first, often called the Velvet Divorce. Now, this country was formed back in 1918, Czechs and Slovaks together after the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. There was this initial idea of equality, but what were the deeper differences there right from the start?
Well, it's interesting. Their paths under the old empire were quite different. The Czech lands, they were more industrialized, more urban. Slovakia was largely agrarian, a different culture, different economy. These weren't just like surface level things. They really shaped distinct identities over a long time.
Right. And then came decades of communist rule. Did that manage to paper over those cracks, or were they just kind of suppressed?
Well, the regime definitely tried to unify things, yeah.
Yeah.
They invested in Slovak industry, tried to bridge the gap. But the underlying cultural and historical differences, they persisted. So when the Velvet Revolution happened in '89, boom, these old divisions resurfaced pretty quickly.
Okay.
You suddenly saw distinct political paths emerging, the Czechs leaning more liberal, market-focused, and the Slovaks more conservative, really pushing for autonomy.
So the authors argue that by the early 90s, things were really coming to a head. Can we maybe group the reasons they give for the split instead of just a list?
Yeah, absolutely. You can boil it down to a few core things. First, those historical and cultural differences. We mentioned different experiences,
Yeah.
Czech secularism versus Slovak tradition.
Okay.
Second, pretty significant economic gaps. I mean, the Czech GDP per capita was about 20% higher in '91. That led to resentment, Czechs feeling they were subsidizing Slovakia, Slovaks feeling dependent.
That makes sense. Economic tension.
Big time. And third, fundamentally incompatible political visions. You had Václav Klaus in Prague pushing hard for rapid market reforms, maybe even separation to achieve that, while Vladimir Mečiar in Bratislava wanted more autonomy, maybe independence. They just couldn't find a middle ground.
Like ships passing in the night, politically.
Pretty much. The authors even quote an analyst saying the costs of keeping the country together would have been extremely high. It suggests the division was almost, inevitable given the leadership stances.
What about other factors? Did things like media or the international situation play a role?
They did. The authors point out that after '89, Czech and Slovak media went their separate ways, creating these separate national conversations. Even a language gap started appearing between younger generations.
Ah, interesting.
And internationally, you had the Soviet Union collapsing, Yugoslavia breaking up violently. That definitely pushed the Czechoslovak leaders towards finding a peaceful way to split. The world wanted stability, too.
But wasn't public support for splitting actually quite low at the time?
That's a really key point the authors make. Yeah, polls in '92 showed only around 36% in either region actually wanted to dissolve the country.
So how did they pull it off?
Well, Klaus and Mečiar, the leaders, they made a calculated decision. They basically decided not to hold a referendum, fearing it would just deepen the divisions and maybe get nasty.
A top-down decision, then. Controversial.
Definitely controversial, but they argued it was necessary leadership to avoid a worse outcome, and it led to the actual Velvet Divorce process.
Right, so how did that unfold? Smoothly.
Remarkably so, especially compared to Yugoslavia. Klaus and Mečiar negotiated through the summer of '92, reached an agreement. The Federal Assembly passed the dissolution law in November, and boom, January 1st, 1993, 2 new countries.
Wow, that's fast. And the assets.
Divided mostly based on population, roughly 2-to-1, Czechs to Slovaks, covered everything from federal property to military hardware. It was methodical.
And the outcome. generally seen as positive.
Yeah, the authors definitely frame it that way. Both countries joined the EU together in 2004. They have good relations. The Czech Republic started off stronger economically, but Slovakia has actually closed the gap quite a bit. It's presented as a win-win, demonstrating that separation can work.
Okay, so connecting this back, how did the split to survive? Authors use this Czech example for Israel. What's the parallel they're drawing for you?
They see a potential parallel in Israel's secular religious divide. They kind of map secular, innovative Tel Aviv and Haifa onto the Czech model, liberal, maybe feeling frustrated by the status quo.
Okay.
And then they compare the more religious communities, Jerusalem, the settlements, to the Slovak side, focused on tradition, identity, maybe needing more state support. They point to similar economic tensions between wealth-generating areas and subsidized ones.
And the politics.
The lack of a unified vision in Israel today, they argue, echoes Czechoslovakia in '92. The key takeaway they offer is that Czechoslovakia shows decisive leadership can achieve a peaceful split, even without massive public support initially. If the underlying divisions are deep enough, it offers a glimmer of hope in their view.
Right, a precedent for an amicable split, perhaps. Now, the second main example, Singapore and Malaysia, this sounds like a very different story. A break for survival, they call it.
Right.
Much quicker, much rockier.
Oh, absolutely. A totally different dynamic. This union only lasted 2 years, 1963 to 1965. Hopes were high initially, but it imploded really fast due to fundamental clashes over race, politics, and economics. Singapore didn't leave. It was essentially kicked out.
Kicked out. Okay, so again, let's group the core reasons the authors give for this split. What were the main drivers?
You had deeply incompatible political visions, number one. Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew and the PPAP, pushed for a Malaysia equality for all races. But the federal government in Kuala Lumpur, dominated by UMNO, prioritized Malay political and economic supremacy.
A fundamental clash right there.
A huge one. And it fueled the second major factor: intense racial tensions. This wasn't just rhetoric. It led to deadly riots in Singapore in 1964. Terrible violence.
Gosh.
And third, major economic disputes. Malaysia wanted Singapore, the economic powerhouse, to contribute a disproportionately large share of federal taxes. Singapore disagreed. Plus, they had different ideas about how the economy should even run free markets versus pro-Malay policies.
So political vision, racial tension, economic conflict. How did these actually play out on the ground?
While politically, Lee Kuan Yew's push for equality was seen by Malay hardliners, the ultras, as a direct threat to their position. UMNO politicians used inflammatory language, one famously called to crush Lee.
Wow.
That kind of talk directly fueled the 1964 riots, which left dozens dead and shattered trust. Economically, the budget dispute in '64 was a major sticking point. Singapore felt exploited, and Singapore's attempts to build political alliances across racial lines were seen as further provocation by Kuala Lumpur.
It sounds incredibly tense. What finally broke it?
It was really the culmination of all these things. By mid-1965, the Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, basically decided the situation was untenable. He feared more violence, maybe even widespread conflict, if Singapore remained in the Federation.
So expulsion was seen as the only way to prevent things from getting even worse.
According to the Tunku, yes. It was a drastic step, born out of a belief that separation was necessary for the survival and stability of both sides, particularly Malaysia. He ordered preparations for Singapore's exit.
And how did the separation actually happen? Was it negotiated like Czechoslovakia?
Not really. It was much more secretive and sudden. Negotiations happened quickly, behind closed doors. The Independence of Singapore Agreement was signed August 7th, 1965, and Singapore was officially out on August 9th.
Just like that.
Pretty much. Lee Kuan Yew's press conference from that time is famous. He was visibly distraught, calling it a moment of anguish. Singapore was suddenly independent, facing a very uncertain future. It joined the UN just weeks later.
And yet, despite that incredibly difficult start, Singapore became this huge success story.
Absolutely remarkable. Tiny island, no natural resources, population under 2 million then. But under Lee Kuan Yew's very strong leadership, they built a strong military, focused relentlessly on attracting foreign investment, cracked down on corruption, emphasized education.
It became a global economic hub.
Exactly. Huge GDP per capita today. The authors contrast this sharply with Malaysia's development path, which was slower and focused more on internal Malay economic upliftment.
So how do the authors connect this story, this survival split, to Israel for you?
Again, they draw parallels. They see Singapore's potential, realize this dynamic, innovative hub, as a model for what Israel's coastal liberal regions could become as an independent state of Dan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Conversely, Malaysia's focus on its core identity group is presented as analogous to how a separate Kingdom of Judah might prioritize its religious and cultural heritage. Singapore's success against the odds is shown as proof that a small state, even born from crisis, can thrive.
And the conflict aspect.
That's maybe the starkest warning they draw from this example. The racial tensions and riots of 1964 are presented as a cautionary tale for Israel's deep ideological clashes. Separation, in this view, becomes a way to prevent that kind of escalation, to avoid potential violence by acknowledging irreconcilable differences.
Two very different splits, then. Czechoslovakia's velvet divorce and Singapore's rather abrupt expulsion. The authors also mention Norway and Sweden splitting in 1905 briefly. What's the point there?
That one's presented more as just reinforcing the basic idea. Norway separated from Sweden peacefully, mostly due to political and economic disagreements. There was near unanimous support in Norway via referendum. Both countries prospered afterwards and have remained close allies.
So another data point showing peaceful splits are possible and can lead to good outcomes.
Exactly. It bolsters the general argument, even if the specifics are less directly parallel to Israel than the other two cases.
Okay, so bringing these historical examples together, what are the main lessons the authors of Split to Survive want you to take away from this chapter for Israel?
They boil it down to 4 key points. First, leadership is absolutely critical. Decisive leaders drove the process in the successful splits.
Right.
Second, there needs to be a sense of mutual self-interest. Both sides ultimately have to see some benefit in separating, even if it's just avoiding conflict.
Okay, makes sense.
Third, separation can actually lead to prosperity for both new entities. It's not automatically a disaster. Look at the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Singapore.
Gotcha. And fourth,
Timing matters. The authors stress the urgency of acting before divisions become so toxic that a peaceful resolution is impossible. They point to things like the 2023 judicial overhaul protests in Israel, the growing influence of religious parties, as signs that the window for a managed separation might be closing.
and they tie this directly back to Israel's internal secular religious divide.
Explicitly, they argue the value clashes mirror these historical cases. They suggest the dynamic GDP-driving coastal areas feel held back, stifled. They even mention warnings, like the supposed resignation of a Shin Bet chief in their scenario, as signs of the risks of inaction, of potentially sliding towards a theocracy if things don't change. Separation is presented as the way out.
So chapter 1 really lays the foundation using these historical comparisons. What's the final takeaway message from this chapter for you, the listener?
The core message of Chapter 1 is pretty clear. History shows that when nations face truly fundamental, irreconcilable internal divides, peaceful separation is a viable path. It's not easy, but it can lead to stability and allow each part to pursue its own destiny.
And they directly apply that to Israel.
Yes, they're essentially telling you, the reader interested in this, that Israel is at such a crossroads, that the Czechoslovak and Singapore-Malaysia examples offer potential models, maybe a state of Dan preserving liberal democracy, and Kingdom of Judah focused on its religious identity. The chapter ends on a note of urgency. This won't happen on its own. Action is needed before it's too late.
Right. So in this deep dive focused squarely on chapter 1 of Split to Survive, we've unpacked these historical cases, Czechoslovakia, Singapore, Malaysia, briefly Norway, Sweden, that the authors used to build their argument for dividing Israel. We've looked at the why, the how, and the what happened next.
And thinking about these cases, the very orderly Czech-Slovak split versus the much more fraught Singapore-Malaysia separation, what aspects really strike you as most relevant or maybe most challenging when you consider Israel's current situation and this proposed solution?
That's definitely something to ponder. And, knowing that in both Czechoslovakia and Singapore, Malaysia, the initial public desire for separation wasn't overwhelming. Well, what does that suggest to you about the role, maybe even the burden, of leadership in moments that could completely reshape a nation?
Huge questions, ones that, as the authors might suggest, maybe warrant digging deeper into the full document you shared, or even into the specific histories of these countries themselves for more context.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this focused exploration of the historical precedents laid out in this very thought-provoking material. We hope this has helped you get a solid grasp on the foundation of their argument.